All right, welcome back to the program. In case you're just joining us, this COVID-19 Watch. This is Moneyline with Nancy segment where we'll keep you up to the minute with everything happening in the world of business and finance. And of course, we're discussing the economics of the pandemic, where, of course, we're following the Economic Sustainability Plan as approved by the Federal Executive Council. Omotola Abimbola, Senior Associate Investments Research, Chapel Hill Denham, is joining me right now from Lagos. Hello, Abimbola, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning. Just in 1 minute, tell me what your view is about the Economic Sustainability Plan. I guess you've seen the documents bouncing back. I think it's about 76 pages or so. Speak to me about what your views are.
Well, I think the plan is a very welcome development because the global economy at the moment is in a very unprecedented environment, whereby we are facing both an healthcare and an economic challenge. And then if you look at the trend over most of the other major economies, both in the developed markets and even in the emerging markets, many of them have deployed unprecedented, monetary and fiscal policy tools in order to help both households and businesses to cope with the very extraordinary shock that we are facing. But for Nigeria, speaking about the economic sustainability plan, I would say that the size of the plan, which is about 2.3 trillion naira, or about 1.5% of GDP, it is very, very paltry if you compare it to the scale of the responses, that we've seen, across the world. In developed markets, for instance, we've seen, many fiscal authorities deploying, up to 15 to, in fact, in some cases, up to 25% of GDP, to counter the shock. But and even in other, larger emerging markets such as China, Brazil and Russia, we have seen fiscal stimulus, up to 3% to 5% of GDP. So Nigeria's, 1.5% of GDP, plan, it is very, very good, as a start. But I believe that for us to avoid the recession this year, the start of the stimulus has to be, a lot more bigger than we have now. But I mean, credit to the fiscal authorities, because one thing we have to factor in is that Nigeria entered into this crisis with very, very little, fiscal and external buffers, which have restricted, the ability and the ability of the fiscal authorities, to engage in counter-cyclical, fiscal policy.
Okay. When you were speaking, you did say, of course, that our own fiscal measures or our own stimulus is not as much as we're seeing in other places abroad. For example, I think even in the EU, there are talks of another 750 billion euro, I think, stimulus package. We've seen what's happening in the US and other Asian countries. If you're saying that this 2.3 trillion, it's not going to be enough, do you think that we have the financial muscle? Where do we even bring out the money from? If, let's say, government is even willing to stimulate the economy more than it is right now, where will the money come from? I just read earlier, our debt profile is rising. We're approaching World Bank, IMF, African Development Bank, and whatever. Is there still the financial muscle that perhaps the government is not aware of?
Well, that's a very excellent point. I mean, as I also pointed out initially, the reason why, we do not have the same level and size of fiscal stimulus is because we do not have the same fiscal space as many of these, advanced and larger emerging markets. For instance, if you look at Nigeria's debt affordability metrics, our debt service to revenue ratio was at a record 99% in the first quarter of the year. So in that sense, we do not have, enough fiscal space to engage in very, very large level of fiscal borrowing. On the other hand, we also had, very, very weak level of fiscal buffers before the crisis struck. For instance, the excess credit account was less than $100 million, before, COVID-19 pandemic started, in March. And also, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority The size of the entire assets under management is less than $3.5 billion, of which more than half of that is already, encumbered, and placed into long-term assets and infrastructure financing. So to be very, very honest with you, our policymakers were dealt a very, very bad hand, because, they lack, the necessary fiscal space, to engage in, extraordinary fiscal stimulus. But this is where, the place of, creative, fiscal thinking and fiscal policies, also come in. I mean, we have said it a number of times, that even the size of our annual budget in Nigeria is very, very, very small. So every year, the Nigerian government spends about, the federal government that is, spends about 7% of GDP, as the expenditure, which is very, very paltry. And out of this 7% of GDP, more than 80% of this is already in recurrent spending, leaving just about 20% for capital expenditure. And that has contributed to the very low level of capital stock in the economy over the years. So the future, I would say, for the government, I mean, it will be twofold. Number one, we have to engage in a lot more fiscal reforms to lift federal government's revenue. Tax revenue as a ratio of GDP is still very, very small compared to peers at about 6% of GDP. And we also have to better engage the private sector to help the government lift some of the burden, that they are shouldering in terms of infrastructure financing.
But the thing is, perhaps if we do not have some kind of fiscal space right now with other African countries, as it were, because we are not just the only ones that are that is reeling from this. The issue also would be, if we do not have fiscal space, is there enough space for the government to carry out some kind of reforms? Like what you've said, our tax to GDP ratio is quite low, about 6%, compared to our peers, other African peers, like 15%, I think, in Kenya, in Ghana, and what have you. But will this be the time to be able to, carry out that? There is, of course, the Finance Act, 7.5%, VAT has been increased to 7.5%. But if government says, okay, we need to do this, is this the right time to do all of that?
Well, to a very, very large extent, the government should be embarking on fiscal expansion during this period of, extraordinary, shock to households and businesses, rather than engaging in fiscal consolidation. But then again, as I said, you don't want to waste a very good crisis. There are some age-long structural reforms that Nigeria should have engaged in, long before COVID-19 pandemic even struck. And one of them is the removal of petroleum subsidies. I mean, there have been several criticisms and even research over the years, pointing out the fact that, fuel subsidy, benefits more of the rich than even the poor people of the country. So there is a need for the government to channel, those resources that we are spending on energy subsidies into, much more socially impactful investments, such as infrastructure development, such as social investment programs, rather. I mean, this current administration, they've done a very, very good job of starting a very, very ambitious social investment program, through the office of the Vice President. We have seen a number of initiatives, such as conditional cash transfer, such as, the government enterprise development program, and a number of other initiatives. These are very, very good, but the reality is that the size of these programs are still very, very small. For instance, just about 1.6 million Nigerians are currently on the National Social Register, and just about 1.2 million households are benefiting from conditional cash transfer. Meanwhile, we have over 80 million poor Nigerians in the country because we have a very high poverty rate at 40%. So essentially, this is the right time for the government to, engage in some delayed reforms that we haven't done over the last couple of years, such as removal of energy subsidies, and channel all these savings into supporting, businesses and households affected by the pandemic, as well as also, engaging, the private sector, to invest more in infrastructure. Because the reality is that if you look at the global economies today, it is awash with cash. We are seeing extraordinary monetary stimulus, across major, systemic central banks. We are also having our own accommodative monetary policy stance locally, which has created a lot of liquidity, for the private sector to tap into. But the reality is that the government does not have the fiscal space to do all the borrowing. So it has to partner with the private sector, by engaging, in more bankable, project finance transactions, public-private enterprises, to engage in infrastructure. And I think we are beginning to see, the government thinking along this line. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Minister of Works and Housing, he introduced a very novel highway development management initiative, which hopes to, partner with the private sector to raise as much as about about 165, billion naira actually, to invest in 10 major highways across the country that will be, jointly managed between the public and the private sector. So we think that we need to see, a lot more ambitious thinking within this line. 165 billion naira is a very good start, but we think that there is enough liquidity locally and even externally to even aim for a much more ambitious plan.
If you're talking about roads, I think I also heard Babatunde Raji Fashola sometime early February, when the CBN had its roundtable, to say that they need about 238 billion naira or so to complete roads or something. And where's the money, going to come from? The private sector came up with an ambitious plan. I think the Nigeria Infraco PLC, which may largely take care of some of this infrastructure, about 15 trillion that is being moved. But that's a topic for another day. Still sticking with some of these monetary measures we're seeing, not just even in Nigeria, but across the world. How do you think that these measures will impact the central bank's balance sheets moving forward? Because even abroad, in the United States, for example, even the UK and all of that, they are printing money. Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK is on an ambitious plan of infrastructure to be able to stimulate the UK economy, a New Deal kind of spending, whereby the UK economy would somehow get out of this pandemic, or perhaps the economic challenge will not be as deep and as steep as possible. But all this would impact the central bank. So how do you see all of this coming back to the balance sheets of the central banks, not just Nigeria?
So, I mean, you made a very, very good point. I think the interesting thing that we are finding out in this current crisis is that, unlike other previous, global and even emerging markets, crises, when central banks typically tighten monetary policy so as to stabilize their exchange rates, and then prevent the balance of payments crisis, this time around, many central banks in the emerging world are now engaging in accommodative monetary policies, and they are also, taking initiative from the bigger developed market peers by engaging in quantitative easing and asset purchase program. So we've had banks like the South African Reserve Bank, for instance, going ahead to purchase, government bonds in the secondary market. But I would say that, locally, in our home country here in Nigeria, we have actually seen enough central bank support for the fiscal authority over the past 3-4 years. Even before this pandemic, the Central Bank of Nigeria, had been supporting the fiscal authorities through the monetization of fiscal deficits, and that has led to about 3.5% of GDP, net outstanding obligations of the federal government to the CBN. But I think one very important thing we have to note is that when you are engaging in quantitative easing, for instance, you also have to make sure that you address, investor concerns about transparency regarding central bank monetization of fiscal deficits. So typically, most developed markets, when they are doing this program, they rather, like to intervene in the secondary market to stabilize interest rates during times of stress by purchasing government bonds. But we've been having the inverse in Nigeria, where the central bank essentially, has been monetizing fiscal deficits even before they get to the secondary market to trade. So I think there has to be, a caveat, while the central bank is trying its best to support the government, they also have to try as much as possible to allay, this investor concern regarding the transparency, of the deficit monetization agenda. And I think towards this, while Nigeria was trying to obtain the $3.4 billion, rapid financing instrument facilities from the IMF, one of the commitments that the federal government made to the IMF is that they are going to try to securitize, their obligations to the central bank, such that the private sector can also, shoulder this burden, and then we can have, a much more transparent, deficit financing plan by the government. So I think we have to make sure that we do this. But to address the second part of your question on whether this extraordinary, monetary and fiscal support that we are seeing, whether they will be enough to prevent a recession, I think not. I think a recession in 2020, I think it's a fait accompli for Nigeria and even, much of the global economy, because the crisis we are facing is not just a demand problem; it's a supply side shock. For instance, in April, Nigeria had to lock down three major states, including Lagos, Ogun State, and FCT Abuja. These states contribute about 50% to economic activity, and these are supply side challenges that we had to impose to prevent the pandemic from spreading. So our own view is that we're still going to have a recession. That's why the strong support we are seeing from both the central bank and also the fiscal authorities. But very, very importantly, to prevent this recession from being a long-drawn, depression, and to ensure a very, very sharp recovery, we have to go a very long way in being very ambitious, about investment spending, in the economy.
Now, Omotola, if we take a look at the 2.3 trillion naira, which the government has said it's the plan to get us out of this, the economic sustainability plan, with its 2.3 trillion, because the government created different scenarios. Without stimulus, we are going to the economy is going to contract, I think, 4.4%. With 2.3 trillion naira stimulus, the economy is going to contract, I think, by 0.49%. With a 3.6 trillion naira stimulus, we're going to contract by 0.42%. So the government went for the 2.3 trillion naira stimulus plan. But my question is that what we need to turn the corner? Should Nigerians be at ease that the government is on top of its game right now to get us out of this? Because from all what analysts are saying, we're going to go into a recession. But the question is how shallow or how deep the recession is going to be. But is this what we really need to turn the corner in terms of perhaps throwing money at some of the fundamental problems we had? Giving out money, social investments, there's a COVID-19 palliative, this and this, but the structural challenges are still there.
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer your question, I would first list out the size of the stimulus we are talking about. So, on the fiscal side, we have 2.3 trillion naira, which is equivalent to around 1.5% of GDP. On the monetary side, we are seeing a stimulus of about 3.5 trillion naira, which is roughly about 2.5% of GDP. So combined, we are seeing a combined stimulus plan of about of over 5 trillion naira, or equivalent to roughly 4% of GDP.
Okay, hold on, Omotola. I want us to get this clear. The 3.5 trillion naira you're saying is from the CBN, isn't it? And
yeah.
And those monies are the monies that have been there for a while with different interventions. I don't want us to mix it up.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that intervention.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's always very useful for us to look at the full size of the support measures coming from both sides of policymakers. But I would say that in Nigeria, households are the biggest driver of the economy, household consumption, because they account for roughly 70% of expenditure. Government is a very, very small size of the economy. Total government spending is less than 6% of GDP, right? So that tells you one thing, that this recovery, right, from this economic shock, it has to be led not just by the government alone, but by the households, because they represent the biggest, buckets of consumption, bucket of expenditure in the economy. So, which is why I believe that although we are seeing a very strong response of the government, for us to see, a much more sharper, recovery, we have to be able to deal with these healthcare challenges that we are facing. We have to be able to try to, to flatten the COVID-19 curve so that the consumer can have more confidence to spend, right? So that we can create more jobs and recover. So I would say that a function of whether we recover very sharply from this pandemic will not be dependent on government spending alone. No, it has to be dependent on the capacity of the healthcare ministry, right, and different healthcare agencies, to be able to flatten COVID-19 curve, and also, which would indirectly also help the consumer to allay his fears and to bring out money from his savings and spend.
I don't really want to go into this flattening curve discussion because I don't think we've seen the peak of the first wave in Nigeria. So we shouldn't even be part of those that are talking of second wave. We're not doing adequate testing. We've not gotten to the peak. We've not seen it yet materialize in Nigeria. But let me take you up on the issue of jobs, because the government is quite optimistic that the 2.3 trillion naira stimulus plan will create millions of jobs for Nigerians. There's the mass housing strategy. In fact, the government itemized, I think, 10 projects in this economic sustainability plan that it was going to look at digital economy, mass housing, and what have you. How optimistic are you that if this is implemented, government will get, Nigerians will get jobs? You understand what I mean? Because we've seen so many government initiatives, so many government projects. This government, for example, is going on with the social intervention programs. You have the farmer money, trader money, market money, N-Power, which I think the second batch has just started. I heard that many, perhaps millions of people applied for the N-Power project. So how much of jobs can Nigeria get? And how many Nigerians would even get these jobs? Do you understand what I mean? And perhaps is that mechanism that the government is using, how sustainable is it also going to be? For example, N-Power, you'll be paying them 30,000 naira every month. Can the government really sustain this? Those that have actually graduated, so to speak, N-Power graduates, what are they graduating into? Are they also graduating into an overbloated labor market already? So many dimensions to my question, Omotola.
Indeed. And in answering your very dynamic question, I mean, I'll point to two things first. Number one, Nigeria has a serious, job creation problem, right? Unemployment rate, the last time it was measured in 2018, was about 23%. And it's even worse, for the youth. Youth unemployment is over 30%. And for a very useful population such as Nigeria, that is a very, very big problem. But the second thing I also mentioned is that Nigeria also has a labor productivity problem in its economy. So close to over 40% of the entire workforce, right, is engaged in agriculture. Meanwhile, the contribution of agriculture to the economy just about 25%, right? So we need to see a lot more improvements in productivity in the economy, right? And that will be very, very important to reduce the number of people, right, who are working in the agricultural sector and channel those people, into more value-adding, employment in the industrial and the services economy, which I think, should be the future of Nigeria as an economy. To do this, we would have to go beyond offering, palliatives and unsustainable, public sector driven, employment schemes such as the Public Works Program, the Empower, etc. These are not sustainable, and it's even very questionable to, to affirm, whether, the people that are being engaged in these services, whether they are truly adding, value to the economy. So we have to go beyond all these small palliatives, and we have to think bigger. And in thinking bigger, like I said, our focus should be how to improve productivity in the economy. And the cornerstone of productivity, right, in every economy, it is infrastructure. And that goes back to my earlier point during this conversation, that Nigeria has a very serious infrastructure deficit that we cannot cure, right, without thinking very, very big and engaging with the private sector a lot more. So we need a lot more investment in infrastructure, particularly, power sector, right? And also the energy sector value chain entirely. We also need to invest a lot more in education, right? Nigeria's adult literacy rate, we have had significant improvement over the past 2 decades. We are now above 60% adult literacy rate. But the two key things we have to talk about literacy level in Nigeria is that the threshold for a country to move from developing to developed is over 80% adult literacy rate. So we still need to see a lot more investment in education in the country. And beyond trying to raise the literacy rate, we also have to improve the quality of the education. There's a World Bank report, published about 2 years ago that says that the average Nigerian who goes to university for 16 years, for instance, in terms of the quality of the education, if you compare it to other markets, it is less than 5 years. So beyond raising the literacy level, we also have to improve the quality of the education. That's the second thing. The third thing we have to focus on, I've mentioned infrastructure, I've mentioned education. The third thing is healthcare, right? Nigeria, like I said again, over the last 2 decades, we've made significant improvement, in all the major healthcare indices, like the mortality rate. We've eradicated polio, we've been investing a lot, in solving non-communicable diseases in the country through the NSIA. All these things are positive. But the reality is that there's still a problem in Nigeria because over 70% of healthcare expenditure is still out of pocket.
Out of pockets, yeah.
Right? Because we do not have a very, very expansive universal health insurance scheme in Nigeria, right? And we also haven't invested enough in primary education, in primary healthcare system, right? So I would say, in conclusion, that for Nigeria to become much more productive, such that we can generate more employment in industry and services, and very, very competitive to export, we need a lot more investment in infrastructure, we need a lot more in education, and we need a lot more in healthcare.
Omotola, the president has the dream and the vision of lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty in the next 10 years, at least since when he announced it, till the next 10 years. This same economic sustainability plan did say that about 39.4 million Nigerians will lose their jobs at the end of 2020. Where's the comma in all of this? Is the government strategy also in tune with the realities right now? Perhaps because of the pandemic, that plan may be a bit derailed. But are you seeing strong and encouraging policies and programs from the government, apart from the social intervention scheme and all of that? Because that can be temporal. But are you seeing strong measures from government to address the job challenge, as well as fulfill the vision of President Buhari of lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty from now to the next 10 years? Of course, his tenure will be over, I think, 2023, if I'm not mistaken. So the next president should be able to carry on with that vision, perhaps.
Well, one thing for sure is that it's going to be a very, very tough task, because our poverty rate in Nigeria today, at 40%, puts the number of Nigerians living in poverty at about 83 million, individuals. And the World Bank, in their recent, reports on Nigeria, they did mention that, the COVID, that on a best case scenario, even without COVID-19, right, they had projected that the poverty head count will even increase further over the next 5 years. But now accounting for COVID-19, right, that implies that it will even be, a lot more worse than they had, projected initially, right? And I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation Nigeria's fight against poverty, right, has to go above the current thinking that creating jobs alone is what is needed. Yes, we need to create jobs, as I've also emphasized, but Nigeria, for its economic size and the number of its poor citizens, has to also have a much more bigger social investment scheme, right? Today, we have over 80 million people over 80 million poor Nigerians, but we have less than 2 million Nigerians in the social registry. I think we have to be a lot more ambitious with this plan and probably think about scaling it up by more than 10 times. But the question would then be, how do you fund, bigger social welfare? So again, that takes us to the need for us to see a lot more fiscal reforms, particularly post-pandemic, right? Currently, the focus over the past, I would say 3, 4, 5 years on trying to boost up tax revenue has been trying to improve tax compliance, right? And trying to bring more people, into the tax net by offering them so many incentives. But I would say that beyond trying to do that, Nigeria also has to realize that for a country with about 60% informal economy, it is very, very difficult for you to grow your tax revenue relying on traditional, tax sources such as, payee tax, for instance, or even the company income tax. We have to focus a lot more on indirect tax measures. And I would say that the heart of the government is in the right place. We have begun, seeing, more focus on indirect tax measures, such as value-added tax. If you look at the other countries, within our, peer category that have very, very large informal economy, many of them have very, very high indirect tax rates to offset that. So that means that we have to focus on generating more value-added tax, generating, more stamp duty taxes. These are the informal, tax measures, that are quick wins for the government, to achieve, its plans to increase fiscal revenue. But my own estimate, currently, Nigeria is currently taxing just about 25%, right, of the possible consumption expenditure through VAT, right? So we still have about 75% coverage to achieve. And to achieve that, we have to do away with some tax exemptions, unfortunately, and we also, try to also, deepen compliance, at all levels, including by the government itself, because just about 22% of government consumption expenditure is being taxed under VAT. So the government also has to, lead the way by showing that it is very serious, about, trying to grow all the informal, measures of getting revenue. And beyond that, lastly, I would say that one thing Nigeria also has to do is try to leverage on the capacity of its state-owned enterprises to increase leverage, right? And also in some cases to divest from some businesses and get money from privatization proceeds. For instance, if you look at the accounts of the NNPC subsidiaries that came out, just a couple of weeks ago, it will tell you that the corporation has very, very low level of operating efficiency, and the private sector can probably do a lot more better, right? But fortunately, the corporation has very, very low level of financial leverage, which means that it can do, a lot more borrowing to invest in the economy and the energy value chain. And one of the projects, that I would say follows along this line is the recently launched, the AKK gas pipeline, which is being, financed, jointly by the NNPC as well as China. That is the kind of, major, far-reaching infrastructure development initiative that we have to, engage a lot more in to deepen investment in infrastructure and also create jobs for the economy.
Okay, Abimbola, just as we move towards the end of the program, because we just have a few more minutes to 12 p.m., what is the role of subnationals in all of this? Because we tend to concentrate on the center. We tend to always call, oh, Buhari, 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 and his ministers. How about the governors, the governors, the governors? For example, about 20 states have slashed about, I think, 1.4, 1.5 trillion naira from their initial budgets. I think Lagos State, for example, Lagos where you are, they had a budget before this pandemic of 1.16 trillion naira, and they did slash about over 248 billion naira from that. So Lagos should be having a budget of about 920 billion naira this year. Rivers State has also cut over 200 billion, I think 230 billion from its budget, making about 300 billion naira it will spend this year. Some states have said, guys, we're suspending minimum wage. I think Adamawa State, Gombe State also cutting salaries of political office holders by 25%. So I'm just giving a background to all of this. And I know that perhaps Labour would also kick to say, we are not earning that much. It doesn't matter if it's a pandemic. You cut your own cloth according to your size so that you can also pay us. So what will be the role of subnationals in all of this? Can our attention as Nigerians also begin to move to these state governments and say, okay, okay, go ahead.
I totally agree with you, Nancy. Subnationals have a, for the lack of a better word for it, they are a major weak link in the governance and administrative structure, of the Nigerian economy. A number of subnationals have been clamoring for more resource controls, but I mean, as they say, to whom much is given, much is expected. Before you clamor for more, federalism, for more resource control, the question is that with the resources that you have been given, have you been able to deliver, efficient service delivery for the citizenry? Right. The question, is left open for everybody to answer. But as of today in Nigeria, subnationals control the primary healthcare system. They control the primary education system, right? And if you look at most of our healthcare indices and education indices, they are still, nothing to write home about. So the question is, are we getting efficient, service delivery from the subnational government? And this is where we also have to see, a lot more focus on these subnational entities. But unfortunately, in this current pandemic period, I would say that the capacity of many of the governments there to spend is very, very limited because they have very low level of internally generated revenue, except for few outliers like Lagos State, right? Many of the subnationals, the high GR to total revenue ratio is less than 60%, right? And unfortunately, the subnationals cannot easily access the debt market because of this reason. There are so many requirements subnationals are required to fulfill before they are allowed to access the debt market, by the government. The first thing they have to fulfill is have a very, very high, high GR to revenue ratio, and so to ensure that their debt is sustainable. So currently, many of them have very low, they record a very, very low, ratio in this particular metric. So they cannot easily access the debt market compared, to the federal government. So that's one particular constraint. Unfortunately for them as well, their major source of IGR revenue, which is PE, would also have been hit, by the current economic, challenges that we are facing, as well as, the social distancing measures, that have been imposed and also being voluntarily, complied with by the private sector to limit the spread of COVID-19. So their capacity to respond in this crisis, I will side with them to an extent, that it is very, very, limited. Okay. So we'd have to see, a lot more support from the central bank, from the federal government, that have, a lot more access to the debt market to help subnationals cope with this crisis. But very importantly, post-pandemic, we need to have a very, very frank conversations, with the subnationals about how, how they have, how their current fiscal shape is, how they can better improve that. Okay. And beyond that, we also have to, engage in, better service delivery for the citizens.
You know what, Abimbola, it's just If we're saying, fine, let's support the governors or let's support the state governments, the question is, even the support that the government had given before, during the Adeosun days, even as Minister of Finance, there was a fiscal sustainability plan, I think, where the states were giving monies to help them offset their salaries.
That's
they gave
correct.
them, yes, about 23 conditions. Some of them did not meet it. Some of them took those monies. We don't know how far with those monies right now. You know, the question also will be, even with the state government slashing their budgets right now by as much as 20%, 20 states about slashing, I think, over 1 trillion from their current budget. The question now is that even the money they have right now, what are they going to be spending it on? That's the A part of the question as we finish. Then the second part of the question is, among the 36 states and FCT, which of those states do you think may be able to weather the storm, this pandemic storm, as we close? Very quickly, we have about a minute to finish.
So to answer your first question, I would say that over the medium term, we have to focus on trying to expand some of the reforms that have been done at the central level to the subnational level. For instance, at the central level, we have seen the TSA implemented, we have seen the IPP implemented, we have seen the gift means implemented. These are very important fiscal reforms that would help reduce revenue losses and also help curb expenditure leakages at the subnational level. I think from the federal legislative arm, we should probably encourage the legislators to find a way to enforce all these very important, fiscal reforms at the subnational level. So that's the first aspect of your question. And then to the second aspect of your question on the states that can better weather this storm, I would say they are the states with very high level of IGR, and I can mention two of them. Lagos State is number 1, and Ogun State is number 2.
Lagos is always coming top. Lagos State, though slashing its budget, the budget for this year will be about 920 billion or so, from about 1.168 trillion naira. Lagos, Ogun. But the question also will be, even with this pandemic, it may also hit the IGRs, because we've been on a lockdown for quite a while, so businesses have not been on. Okay. Thank you very much, Abimbola. Thank you for your perspectives this morning. I hope that our viewers have been able to take one or two things. As we get ready to move to the news studio, let me just ask you this final question. What should Nigerians expect from this 2.3 trillion? Okay.
I think they should expect some impact, but they should also temper their expectation, because it is very, very paltry compared to the size of the economy.
So we should approach it with caution. Thank you very much,
With
Abimbola.
caution, indeed.
Thank you very much, Omotola.
Thank you
for speaking with me.
It's been my pleasure.
All right, I've been speaking with Omotola Abimbola, a Senior Associate Investment Research, Chapel Hill Denham. We've been looking at the government's economic sustainability plan as released by the Vice President's Committee and as approved by the Federal Executive Council.